Welcome to Courage and Faith. I'm glad you're here. This is a place for honest conversations about what it means to stand strong in a culture that's constantly changing. We're not here to stir fear or to add to the noise. We're here to bring clarity, courage, and truth that's rooted in God's Word. This podcast exists to strengthen your faith, sharpen your convictions, and remind you of this simple truth. You are not alone, and you were never meant to live afraid. Enjoy the podcast. All right, I want to welcome you to the Courage and Faith podcast. I'm so glad to have you joining with us, and I believe it's going to be really one of the most important conversations that we've had on the podcast. If you've been paying attention this last decade, you've probably noticed that it feels like our culture has shifted and changed almost overnight. Ideas that once seemed fringe are now mainstream. We've watched confusion around gender ideology, sexuality, identity politics, critical race theory, DEI initiatives, just ongoing. And for many Christians, it feels overwhelming. They know that something's changed, but they just can't seem to explain why. So we're going to talk about that for a few moments. And our guest today, it's my privilege to have Dr. James Lindsay. He's a mathematician, author, researcher, founder of New Discourses. He's the co-author of a book that I highly recommend called Cynical Theories. He's the author of Western Marxism, another great book, and one of the people behind the Grievance Studies Affairs. If you don't know what that is, just Google it and enjoy. For nearly a decade, James has been one of the leading voices helping people understand the philosophical movements behind today's cultural revolution. And one of the things that I've appreciated about his work is that he consistently reminds us that ideas have consequences. And so we're going to talk about those. And James, I want to welcome you to the podcast.
Hey, thank you very much.
So I first got introduced to you through your book, Cynical Theories. It was 2020. The world was melting down. Though I thought I understood what was happening, I was still, being very confused by the ideology. Everything was so fast moving and trying to understand what was really occurring. And I read your book, Cynical Theories. I had a chance to hear from you at the first Turning Point Faith Pastors event with Charlie when he had brought you there. And it was so incredibly helpful. And I just wanted to bring you to my friends and my audience, hopefully next year to our conference, and talk about these issues. And so I just want to begin by saying, this question is, okay, what is really going on? So many people are still confused and still like, it'll pass. I've heard this so many times. The pendulum will swing back. And the reality is that's not the reality. So the floor is yours.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. And that was really a great event in Coronado. So I'm glad that we got to do that together way back in, somewhat easier times that were still crazy. So it's hard to describe. There's different theories. First of all, just say that I'm going to present my view of what has happened. There are other perspectives on what has happened. I think those people are wrong. And so just to be very blunt about it, but not everybody necessarily fully agrees with this analysis. But my analysis is that our culture, our society has been under attack by something that should be broadly called Western Marxism. A lot of people call this cultural Marxism. That term itself is fraught, but it's also familiar. But the idea was that in the early 1910s and 20s, the Marxist thinkers in Europe, somewhat in America, they came to America during World War II and just before, but a lot of these Marxist thinkers in Europe started to realize that Karl Marx's hypothesis that capitalism would immiserate the workers, make them a natural basis for revolution that want a better life, basically fell apart in World War I. It hadn't manifested before World War I, and then World War I kind of just proved it. The only place that ends up going Marxist by that point, by about 1920, is Soviet Union, which was a feudal society, not a capitalist society. It had not yet undergone industrialization. And so this was against what Marx had thought. And they thought, well, we've got to figure out how to explain this. Soviet Union did what we didn't expect. Europe did also something we didn't expect. Rather than having a mass awakening of the workers who overthrew their society, they went extraordinarily nationalist when the war showed up. All of a sudden, British workers were British, Italian workers were Italian, German workers were German, and you name it, French workers were French. That became a much more meaningful identity to them in the light of the war than their international worker solidarity identity. And so all of a sudden, this is all thrown into relief that Marx's predictions that he called the science of history, scientific socialism, and dialectical materialism were not correct. And they had to figure out why, because, of course, Marxism is a fanatical faith. They're not going to abandon it because the world said it's wrong. They're going to twist it around and figure out what piece of the details they must have been missing to keep the thing going. It's like a bad end times prediction. The world's going to end on October 23rd, 2012, and it doesn't. So they have to cook up some excuse for why it didn't. But they don't abandon necessarily that eschatology. And the conclusion that they came up with is that in capitalism, it doesn't just produce a means of exchange. It produces a culture that reproduces, that self-reaffirms itself. So people become capitalists. They believe in capitalism. They believe in free enterprise. They enter in usually as small business owners or small participants or employees, and they actually can make money. Once you solve the monopoly problem, basically, they can succeed. And so industrialization grew to the big point of monopoly. That's the Gilded Era. And then we kind of all realized this isn't going to work. Henry Ford, even not exactly the nicest character in history, realized that it would be good business to pay his workers enough to buy his own product and to create kind of like a hamster wheel of economic flow. And he turned out to be right. So the workers became a middle class. So capitalism produces a middle class, a stable middle class that won't be revolutionary. So they needed a new theory. And the idea was to go in and attack the cultural foundations of that Western civilizational culture. It was to attack its culture-producing institutions, which are named in the 1910s as family, religion, education, media, and law. We could add some to that, I think, at this point, or differentiate media into entertainment versus news versus, there's a lot of things we could do to make it more complicated, which I think would be fair. Healthcare is probably a new institution at this point, that you could add to the whole pile. But at any rate, the goal was to figure out how to transform people's attitudes by relentlessly doing what came to be known as a critical theory. And the critical theory is that people believe that they are working to make the better world, but they're not questioning the foundation of the idea of better. Like better in what way? Better in terms of what? Solving problems, better in terms of making more money, better in terms of having more material goods and comfort, air conditioning in the heat wave, as we've all been joking about all summer. But is that really better in a qualitative sense? Is that just, locking us even further into this culture of capitalism? Remember, they're socialists, so better means socialism. And so their idea is that what we call material progress is, in fact, which is the ability to solve real problems in the world, is not material progress. It's actually tightening the noose of capitalism around our own necks. And nobody hardly at all has the ability to see outside of that. And the better things get, the less they can see outside of it. So they have to question the whole thing from its foundations. That's the critical theory. That's what it was invented to do. It first gets written about and named in 1937 to kind of put a timeline on that. So about 20 years after Western Marxism kind of takes off, we now have the advent of the critical theory. And through the history of the 20th century, what happens is this thing is trying to find out ways to undermine the Western civilizational canon. It has a problem, which is called the truth. Not that it's against the truth, even though it kind of is, but rather the fact what it's actually doing is blurring together things that are social conventions, ways that we're all kind of deciding we're going to behave. Our money works like this or whatever, and then facts of, like, say, human, psychological, sociological, even physical and economic reality that you can't get around, like that if you put rent controls, the laws of supply and demand bottom out your entire market. Like you can't get around that, but they can't tell the difference. The critical theory loses the ability to tell the difference between things that, when we're practicing, say, our religion, we all dress like this, and then 10 years later, we all dress like that. And so it's something that can be changed. They can't tell the difference between that and like the laws of supply and demand. And they think that that's also just a cultural artifact. And 10 years from now, we could have a completely different set of economic laws. It'd be fine. Not realizing that those are based in the realities of how things genuinely work. Okay, so they're trying to figure out how to do this, but their weakness, there's ultimately their kryptonite is the truth. They're using the truth badly. They're mostly lying with the truth. They're pointing out real problems and then saying it's the system that produces the problems. It's kind of like, we have traffic accidents. Nobody likes traffic accidents. Nobody wants traffic accidents. Nobody wants fatalities on the highway. But they're pointing and saying, well, if we didn't have cars, we wouldn't have traffic accidents. So let's just get rid of cars, right? And so they're looking at problems that come up. Sometimes there's winners and losers. Sometimes things are unfair. Sometimes there's market bubbles or whatever happens, and saying, well, if we didn't have capitalism, that wouldn't happen. So let's just get rid of capitalism. If we didn't have private property, we wouldn't have these problems. So we'll get rid of private property. It's the same idea that, the solution to getting rid of cancer is killing the patient, or the solution to getting rid of traffic fatalities is getting rid of cars or roads altogether or whatever. It's actually how they think. It's called systemic thinking, systemic racism we all heard about. And ultimately, as long as they were kind of stuck with having to respect the idea that there are true things about the world, that truth is actually in some sense absolute, they had a huge problem and they couldn't get anywhere. They also weren't very popular. Their critiques were sort of annoying. Theodor Adorno spent decades criticizing jazz, which it just turned out people liked. And so you don't really get anywhere with that. Musical innovation is something people enjoy. And so you don't get anywhere just being a crank. But then it comes along postmodernism in the 1960s, 50s and 60s it starts. It comes actually out of an art movement that then gets turned into a philosophical movement. Well, art, then literary, then philosophical, where it's like, there's basic rules for how you're supposed to produce art that has meaning. And what if we just start bending the rules? What if we do the Matrix thing and say there is no spoon, there are no rules, we can do whatever we want, and convince people that a banana duct taped to the wall is making some kind of a poetic statement or something at the far end of that channel. And this gets pulled into the philosophical realm, and it's kind of like a profound cultural relativism. It takes this idea of the criticality that we're locked into a single culture of capitalism, and then it says, wait a minute, maybe everything is just locked into a particular culture. Maybe truth itself is just a product, a contingent product of a culture, that there are no actual realities. At this point, there's a lot to that history. We don't have to get into the details. Yale University bringing them in, the English department and all of this, and it was largely feminists and English departments that wanted to tear apart the idea of sex roles that imported all this crap into America. But the long and short of it was that this opened up the floodgates for the critique to not have to worry about if the thing that it was saying was grounded in truth or reality anymore. There was your truth and my truth. Truth became an individual, or actually a group-based phenomenon. All people of a particular demographic group experience similar types of oppression. If they won't admit it, they're probably Uncle Toms or have some kind of race traders or whatever, or gender traders or sex traders. They all experience kind of similar lines of oppression, and they must speak about those things critically. But it comes from a position of my experiences or my lived experience or my truth is, and there's, like I said, I've glazed over a lot of details of how these things fuse between maybe 1970 and 1990. But in that period, what happened, and this was the question you asked me, what happened? A massive fundamental epistemological shift occurred in the American body politic and collective society. Most younger people stopped being taught to think in terms of the logos, what's true, what's real, how does reality work, and started being taught to think in terms of the other two Greek rhetorical styles, ethos and pathos. Okay, so ethos is this idea of like reputation or authority. Are you an ethical person? Are you trustworthy? And so what they did was they created a false ethos around the idea of fighting oppression. And so if you're fighting oppression, you're a good person. If you're upholding oppression, you're a bad person. So this is actually the literal inversion of real ethos. but they bring people in and then they abuse them with how, like psychologically abuse these people with how traumatizing oppression is for the people who suffer it. And they bring in the negative emotional side of it, and that's the pathos. So rather than building a society based in the rock of logos, you have this simulation of being a good person, the simulacrum really of being a good person that's called, false ethos. And they attach the major thinking style to pathos, to emotion, to literally pathological ways of interpreting events in front of you. And thus we're not on the rock of logos anymore. We're now in the sand of pathos, being directed by charlatans who are projecting a false meaning of what it means to be a good person, to give themselves authority. And so this is ultimately what happened. And like I said, starting at least by 2005 for certain, but earlier than that, especially in states like California, which were way ahead of this curve. They had ethnic studies back to the 60s, mandated in their California system universities. They had experimental high schools doing all of the woke stuff before anybody knew what woke was. I mean, back in the 80s even, they had this highly woke curriculum. And then you had all those experimental colleges like the Evergreen State University in Washington opening up in the 60s and 70s that were doing a lot of this experimental stuff too. And they started to transform a 1 and then 2 and then 3 generations to think in this follow the charlatan leader, false ethos, and let your emotions be your guide, pathos, sand of pathos, construction of reality. So this vast epistemological shift, the way that we interact and understand the world, got pulled right out from underneath our feet. It's like we were all trying to stand on the rock, but we didn't realize there was a rug underneath us, and they just pulled us into quicksand. And then by the time we figured this out, in the crisis emergency of 2020, or for some of us 2012, 2015, it started to rear its head and be obvious. It was really, in some sense, too late. We had entire generations, or at least halves of generations, thinking like this. We had a problem for years where boys were chasing girls who think like this, because if you want to have a girl that you can go out with and have a date, you've got to pretend you're woke, and they wouldn't date you otherwise, which is still kind of a thing.
Yeah. So let's pause for a moment and just define, let's define woke. And that I want to kind of flesh out, because for the average everyday person, going to church on Sunday, or they know a little bit, they hear me maybe throw out some things and castigating woke, or sometimes just try to sum up critical theory in a very simplistic form, so oppressor versus oppressed, where it then becomes, what you're saying is the lived experience, which is a term I hear a lot of people using, even in the Christian world, and it really frustrates me because we're using terminology without understanding what's connected to it.
Yeah, that's right.
And
that's right.
That is it's higher than, or it's greater than maybe what truth actually is, because it's your experience, and so that is elevated over, and that's So when we think about this, maybe just talk for a moment about woke and give an example from 2020 on of how this has played out. Like you just kind of gave the foundation of where this came from, but maybe we can crystallize and give like a specific, this happened and this is why.
Okay. Yeah, that's easy. So you're lucky, because I've been spending the last 10 years trying to figure out how to define woke in a way that's both comprehensive and comprehensible. I don't know that I've achieved the second one, but I've got a comprehensive definition that can fit in the space of a single post on Twitter now. It's basically a sentence with a little bit of explanation. And so first thing you have to know what woke, well, I'm going to say two things you have to know as kind of foundation for woke. Number one is that it's woke. They woke up. They are awakened to a different appreciation of reality. Okay. Yeah. So if you do have firm Christian roots and you're listening, this is very similar to the Gnostic awakening to a hidden reality that the old Gnostic heresies presented, but now in a new sociological way. Okay, so the second thing, though, is that you have to understand that all the way back to the deep precursors, even before Marxism, of this line of philosophy, is this concept of it not being enough to think and it not being enough to act. You have to think and act together. So your thinking and your action have to be combined. They call this theory and praxis. So Marxism, in some sense, maybe it's the Western variant that I just described, with the postmodern twist at the end that we recognize as woke, has a theoretical component where they're describing how they believe the world works. And then the second piece is that there is action that is connected to that. You have to think woke and act woke to be completely woke. And so there are ways of thinking and ways of acting or being that are intrinsic, and there's no way to separate these things. So theory and action, or theory and praxis, they say, are actually wedded. And so they're, I mean, in the Christian sense, they're like one flesh. They cannot be taken apart one from another. So your action is guided by your theory, and then the results of your action inform your next iteration of theory that never leaves its essential goal of disrupting the existing society in order to replace it with socialism. That's always the underlying goal. They can call it equity, they can call it whatever they want, but it's still the same underlying goal. Okay, and so woke means thinking woke and acting woke. It means thinking with critical theory. Technically, it means having awakened to a critical consciousness, which is a belief that critical theory is necessary to understand the world around you.
Yeah.
And the right way to analyze everything in front of you. And it's acting woke, which in short is acting. You can pick your favorite historical evil. You can pick the Jacobins of the French Revolution. You can pick the Bolsheviks of the Russian Revolution, Vladimir Lenin. I usually say it's acting Leninist. Or if you want to be kind of the most technically accurate, it's the more modified versions that we have later that are based off of Mao Zedong, or after the kind of South American liberation revolutionaries like Che Guevara and even Fidel Castro and these fellas, or in the practical terms of today, the Palestinians. And so this set of actions, however you want, I usually locate it in Lenin. Mao is probably a little better. I actually know more about Mao, but Lenin is sort of like the primordial example here. But what that means is kind of two things. Number one is that you employ a friend-enemy distinction in tribal politics. There's some problem out in the world. Everybody who upholds that problem is part of the problem. They're the enemy. They have to be destroyed because it's a existential threat to people like us. Everybody who's willing to fight the enemy is our friend. So the enemy of my enemy is my friend is part of the logic. That's why you see Queers for Palestine. They're both fighting the same thing, which is Western civilization, capitalism, freedom, the American Constitution. So they're friends. So everybody who fights the enemy is friends. Anybody who refuses to fight the enemy is enemy. So if they come to you and their fist is up and they say, Pastor, you need to care about racial justice, and you're like, I'm not racist, I don't want to get involved, you're now enemy because you're complicit in upholding the system.
Yeah.
So that's the friend-enemy politics or tribal politics. And the other is Machiavellian behavior. It's not even necessarily the terrorism or the violence or any of this. That's all part of how it plays out in practice from the friend-enemy stuff mostly. But Machiavellian behavior means you're willing, Machiavellian political rules would be that you are willing to lie, cheat, or steal in the pursuit of power because the end of achieving power justifies the means you use to get it, which can include violence even. Okay, so if you play by Machiavellian political rules that you gaining power is the end that justifies any means to get it, and you have a friend-enemy tribalism baked in where if you are not fighting against the bad thing, then you're the enemy too, then you're acting woke. So it is thinking that critical theory analyzes things. Critical theory therefore determines who are the enemies, and then acting accordingly with a friend-enemy tribalism and a Machiavellian approach to taking power to solve your problems. That's honestly a very comprehensive definition of what it means to be woke.
Yeah.
Those are some specialized terms. I understand there's maybe 3 or 4 specialized terms, but it's actually not that hard to understand. And it explains all the behavior you saw. I even did the fist raised up. Everybody remembers that scene, I think, from the COVID lockdown period / racial justice, doesn't count point where there was that young woman sitting at a restaurant who actually supported Black Lives Matter, and they had a crowd of 50 some odd angry radicals most of them wearing masks with fists raised in her face, demanding she raise her fist and say Black Lives Matter. And she even agreed with the protesters, but she said that she didn't want to be forced to do a symbolic action, and she became this target of evil, right? So almost everything you saw unfold where, either you get on board with Black Lives Matter and become an anti-racist, or else you are a racist. You either become a friend that fights against racism, as they define it, in critical race theory being the critical theory is the definition of the enemy. The enemy is a racist, and the friends are the anti-racists. And if you won't join in like that young woman, according to the terms they set for you at that moment, then you are also an enemy to be attacked. And of course, they can use whatever means they want. They can lie on television. They can send Kimberly Crenshaw, the creator of CRT, on television and say critical race theory is not in schools, lying straight through her teeth, knowing it's in schools, having written about how it's being infused into schools. They can lie. They can do riots. The riot is the sigh of the oppressed. They can get politicians to come and bail them out of jail for criminal enterprises that didn't just do billions in property damage, but actually ended up killing people. Anything's justified in the name of their so-called racial justice paradigm. Even suspending COVID, we weren't allowed to go outside for 2 years or something, for a year. But they could literally, COVID got put on pause if and only
the virus didn't spread.
The protest. That's right. Why? Because it's ultimately this Machiavellian politic that justifies anything as long as it's in the pursuit of the power that they're seeking.
So let's pause there for a moment. I want to crystallize this a little bit further, and I want to bring it into the context of the church world. That's already in, but I want to bring it a little further. So one of the things that I see within this is, churches, I'm told, are not to be political, which is nonsense. You can't be a faithful Christian without truly loving your neighbor. And one of the things that we see that I tell people is, pick your favorite pastor or whatever, and they say, hey, we're not political. Go back to 2020 and 2021 and see how many struggle sessions they were having. And we're getting into the Chinese, Cultural Revolution and all those things. Struggle sessions meaning that, and I say this, hey, if you are a racist, you should repent of that. You should love everybody instead of partiality. But the most fearful thing in our culture, one of them is to be called one. So if you're in a racist culture, you would care less if that was the case. But we have this innate fear, and that has really been massive in the church. We went through the BLM moment, and with a desire to not appear to be racist, in particular the evangelical church moment that I'm a part of, we went out of our way, which in one sense is okay at the beginning, but then it got really weird. And everybody that said they weren't political, then all of a sudden was aligning, platforming, or moderating their other views so as not to offend. And so you wrote about this in Race Marxism. You spoke about this to pastors. This has been an ongoing thing. And the truth is, it's still on an ongoing issue. So somebody that's going to a church that is, pro DEI, that's anti-racist, or, pastors that have been still having, I say it like this, just to be frank, pretending that they struggle with racism so that they can try to identify with someone they're interviewing. What would you say to them? Can I help them through this? Because they've been drinking the cultural Kool-Aid, and it's a deception.
It is a deception. And in fact, like you brought up the Mao's Cultural Revolution, it's actually a very Maoist technique. The struggle session is kind of its ultimate expression. But the purpose of the struggle session, as Mao put it out, was to, and this is as close to the exact wording as I can remember, is to get the target to see the world from the standpoint of the people. Okay, so in other words, the people were the people who supported socialism. Mao said that explicitly. He says the people who are supporting the building of socialism and helping us do it are the people. Everybody who resists it is the enemy of the people, so they're not the people. So the people are the people who are socialists, and the goal is to get people to see from the standpoint of the people. And the point of this is to put you in an emotional situation in order to get you to abandon, again, the logos, the truth. You have this charlatan that's coming in with moral authority about racism. That's your false ethos that is trying to use that to get you to abandon the logos of are you actually judging partially or with arbitrary power over arbitrary characteristics, or are you doing something of, racist? And they're trying to get you to abandon that actual logos, the real meaning of that term and its real intention, to enter into an emotional state in which they are going to try to traumatize you by getting you to associate your past actions or your complicity or your refusal to be political or whatever with upholding racism and causing harm that brings you into that pathological, that sympathetic or empathetic state, as they call it. That same pathos, by the way, pathos, sympathy, empathy, it's the same pathy. It's also the same pathy and psychopathy. It's the same pathy. It's the same pathos. They're trying to pull you into that emotional analysis instead and get you to abandon logic, so that what you will do is transform. The term for it in Chinese translates directly to ideological remolding. So they're trying to get you to reframe how you see the world through this emotional injury that your false ethos fraud or charlatan is putting you in. And the goal is to transform your fundamental worldview from one of truth or one of love, one of, logos, if you want, to one that they control. And so when you give in on this, just to go along, to get along, to be nice, to play a lot, for the sake of argument, I'll try it out or whatever. What you're actually doing is giving, in some sense, you're giving away like a piece of your soul to somebody that's manipulating you with it. And so this is a really wicked manipulation. And it's, like I said, very finely developed over the last century, maybe the Jacobins did something like this, but certainly the Soviets did, certainly the Bolsheviks did stuff like this. And Mao Zedong turned it into an art. Their entire very interesting books written about how, while more or less Stalin ruled the Soviet Union with the iron fist and a rifle, and not that Mao didn't have an iron fist and a rifle, but he primarily created a psychological totalitarianism that manipulates people to get them to change their fundamental worldview to agree with his, which is ultimately, again, this weird false doctrine of absolute equality being the fun, and doing, like, in a weird humanitarian sense, absolutely doing no harm whatsoever. So this idea that, different people have different talents, and then from the parable of the talents, put them to different uses, therefore we'll have different outcomes, and from the parable of the talents, the master can then judge those different outcomes based on the character and the outcomes that were in front of him. This is thrown out for a radical egalitarianism and a radical humanitarianism that throw out all the relevant details of circumstance, of character, of virtue, of effort, of, producing a worthy fruit, and say, nope, everything's equal. Good fruit, bad fruit, it's still fruit. It's all equal. There's so many biblical things here that pastors or Christians should think of. Like, this is the difference between the sacrifices of Cain and Abel. This is, like I said, the parable of the talents is sitting right in front of you. There's so many different kind of Christian stories or parables or whatever that tell you that this is not the way to be, but that's the thing that they're actually luring you into. Yeah. And it's seductive, and like the emotions start flowing, and you start feeling like I'm doing something good, and you can get all twisted, and you feel bad and good. Actually, there's some books about this too, the psychology of this. You can feel bad and good at the same time. You feel horrible about all the racism you participated in, but good that you're confessing it. It's actually called, in this book called Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism, explaining how all this works. He calls it the cult of confession, that this approach brings in. And obviously Christians are not called to be in a cult, and so they should really guard their hearts in that regard. This is why the Bible warns about being pulled around by a lying or deceptive heart all the time, or part of why. And we've got to John 1 is very clear that the word is the logos, and this becomes flesh in Jesus. And if you're getting pulled off of that, you're probably thinking you're being a good person, but you're being deceived, and you're actually not being a good person. Yeah, and if you're getting some kind of reward or some kind of threat, Matthew 4 tells you all about Jesus being tempted in the wilderness and pointing that there are higher and more important things to stick to than the immediate pleasures and fears of the world.
So in many ways, I think we look at like this, these are competing worldviews.
Yes.
The logos where, truth, reality, which we'd say is based upon Christ, and where we would adopt our moral framework Judeo-Christian ethic. We'll get to that in a little bit. But so they're competing worldviews. And, as you said, if I try to encourage people I know in this way, if you're a pastor or you are a pastor and you're unwilling to be clear about these things, then you are cooperating in confusion. You're allowing people to walk away with whatever they feel like would most be agreeable to them, that you agree with them, which I believe is participating in evil. And so we think about, DEI initiatives, you maybe, I wouldn't separate the secular and the spiritual. I think they're all merged together, but you go to the workplace, you go to different things and they say, hey, we want you to take these initiatives. We want you to have this training. And you just say, you know what? I agree, because I have to agree. Like you said, you do lose a part of yourself. And unfortunately, we haven't found a lot of courage in the pulpit to call these things out. And so it's continued and been in many ways codified within the church. We've seen, the majority of major denominations accept a part of this. Movements that, I had connected with in the past have global DEI boards and all sort of nonsense. And I wasn't even aware. I had no idea that these things were accepted. So within that, before we pivot to the friend-enemy distinction and kind of highlight Tucker, Candace, the woke right, what's happening there, because that's impacting the Christian world, the evangelical world in a significant way. I can give you final thoughts on this aspect. I would just say James has some great material that you can lean into. Clips, podcasts, things of that nature. It is so important that if you're going to be a Christian, you don't pick and choose from the smorgasbord of other worldviews that would make you live easier in our world. You actually look at life through the lens of Scripture, and you interpret world in that way. And so adopting this philosophy, which is quite awful, which has led to the result of, transing the kids, of the sexually explicit material that we've had to go into schools and rally against school boards to try to get it removed. All of this is the fruit that comes from that root.
Yeah, also if you want to, the trans thing is about as horrible as it can get. The deliberate anti-education, it's beyond indoctrination. The anti-education of our children is damage that's incalculable to them and to their futures and to our society and so everybody that lives in it. But these Pakistani rape gangs that you're not even allowed to talk about really in Britain, 250,000 girls maybe being victims of this was totally excused. I was talking about this back in 2019, in fact, and I kind of stopped. I regret that. I didn't understand the scope of it, or I don't think I would have been able to. But I was even pointing at this and nobody cared. Nobody was paying attention, but that's beside the point. The point is it was all being excused on a doctrine of to say it was happening was racist. Yes. And so when you said that this is a collision of worldviews, to put it in its starkest terms, the worldviews are at the very bottom that reality is as it is and that we exist within the reality that we have. There is objective truth. There is, not every moral question is objectively determined. Some things are contingent, like how are you going to dress for this dinner or whatever. But and there are ways that you could do that really wrongly. But there are profound truths there. So that's the one worldview. We're in a reality that exists independent of us. There is a right way to be in that reality. There are physical laws, there are moral laws, and we can come to know them. And then there's the other one, which is no, we can't actually. Everything's sort of up for grabs. And in fact, we are the masters and creators of our own reality. And if you put that in biblical terms, it's very clear who runs the two worldviews is God and Satan run those two worldviews. And it is actually that stark. It is we create the world that we live in versus the world was given to us and we have, roles and duties and obligations within it. And reality is actually real versus reality is something we create according to our own whims, desires, interests, and efforts. And it's so important to realize that these little slips are indicative of a big difference in the way you conceive of the world. So this is why you get not just like small bad fruits, like, division in families is a pretty significant one, but it's small by comparison of 250,000 ignored sexual assaults of young white British girls.
Yeah.
And I only bring up their race, by the way, because it's literally the only race that was targeted. The Pakistanis the Muslims were literally targeting them explicitly by their race, explicitly as an effort of conquest. And then this gets covered up and ignored to the point where we're talking likely at least 250,000 girls as victims.
Yeah, which is absolutely horrific and unbelievable. And when race Marxism gets played out, you see whether it's a refusal to report, like, just the other day, car runs into a crowd of people.
Yeah, right, exactly.
There was actually someone driving that car, and there was a ideology behind that, and that's kind of the outworking. There's because the oppressed matrix and the confusion within that, there's an unwillingness to deal with reality because of the emotional blackmail.
Exactly.
Right. So we'll kind of come back around to that at the end. I want to pivot for a moment, and I want to pick up where you said the friend-enemy distinction, and I want to set it up in this way. Charlie Kirk, who you're good friends with, and I have the utmost respect for, and we've just hosted Make Heaven Crowded tour. We pray and love Erica and the whole team at Turning Point. I've been involved with Turning Point Faith. Rob McCoy, a dear friend, he'll be at our conference coming up in just a few weeks. Chloe Cole and others, and I'm so appreciative. I had the privilege to host Charlie at our church, and just a lot of wonderful things. So I set all that up to say is I did have, before he was brutally assassinated, martyred from my perspective, I did have something I did not agree with. And my disagreement with, I understood maybe his perspective. I was in a text stream with other pastors, and I think I understand what he was trying to do was argue ideas in the public square and win that argument and build a coalition. But I found it difficult, and I grew very frustrated with, I didn't feel like we should be platforming people that are rabid anti-Semites or even closeted, that do not have the best interests in mind. They may pretend to be our friend. And so I'm kind of setting this up. They say, well, they're on the right, so I'm not going to say anything against them because it's right versus left. And I understood what he was trying to do, but I found it problematic, and I still find it problematic because there's something happening within the right. You've referred to it accurately, or I agree with it, with the woke right. And we see this being played out with Megyn Kelly, who refuses to denounce she denounces lots of people. She just doesn't want to denounce the anti-Semitic people or others that are helping her make money. That's my opinion. But we see that with Tucker Carlson. We see this, there's a myriad of others, Candace, who have all seemingly turned at the same time as if they were reading from the same script and parroting something, I believe they are, and parroting something with the goal of transforming the right, transforming our alliance with Israel, and all of these things. We know it goes to Alexander Dugin. There's lots of things that people listening would say, I have no idea what we're talking about yet, but I just want to inform the friend-enemy distinction, why that's wrong, why it's bad, what's happening right now, and talk about that a little bit.
So, I mean, like I just said, I could give you a full-blown account of the friend-enemy distinction without ever naming where it actually came from, what its actual purpose is, just by describing the behavior of either French Revolutionary Jacobins or communists, like the Bolsheviks or the Maoists. I could give it to you all in terms of just a construction out of Mao's the people versus the enemies of the people, where effectively the belief is that you have an oppressive society and everybody who is either unaware of it or who is participating in that society is upholding the oppression. The oppression causes harm. Therefore, they're complicit in all of those harms. That's the systemic thinking. And anybody who isn't willing to fight against that is part of the problem. The only way to get moral absolution is to put up your fist and fight against it. And you can get to the friend-enemy distinction purely from talking about communism, but it doesn't get its name from a communist. It gets its name from a reactionary. It gets its name from Carl Schmitt, who went on after he discussed this. He wrote about it in a book called The Concept of the Political, which was first published in 1927 and republished, or I think it was, I'm not exactly sure why it came back out in 1932, but 32 is usually the year that's cited as its publication date. And then in 1933, Hitler becomes chancellor. He eventually very quickly becomes dictator within a couple months. By maybe April, I think he's dictator, and Schmitt joins the Nazi Party immediately and goes about justifying the Nazi political regime in terms of all of the philosophy he wrote through the previous decades. And so Carl Schmitt, it wasn't a Nazi when he wrote it down, became a Nazi, ends up surviving somehow his Nuremberg trial. The Nazis really decided they didn't like him in the middle of all this. By 37 or 38, they decide they don't like him anymore, kind of sideline him, but they don't crush him. And somehow that leads to him surviving his Nuremberg trial. But at any rate, the friend-enemy distinction, he says, is the essential quality of politics. That politics itself boils down to this state of existential conflict between friends and enemies. If it doesn't do that, it's not politics. And what he was saying is that liberal regimes, meaning not the Democrats, but like the Constitution of the United States of America, Western Europe, up to that point, dabbling in different strains of liberal thinking, refuse the political. They deny the political because they don't think in terms of friends and enemies. They think in terms instead of coalitions and cooperation, win-win situations where they can be had. And they only resort to the friend-enemy distinction, which is essentially the characterization of war, when they must. And so, only in the point where there's a legitimate existential threat do they give in and think in terms of friends and enemies along those lines. So why is it bad because it was a Nazi? No, it's not. He even wrote it before he was a Nazi. While he even opposed the Nazi rise to power, he just caved in when they got power and gave himself away to it. Okay, so why is it bad? Well, number one is because it's tribal, but number two is because of the way that it actually functions. If you read Schmitt closely, he defines the enemy very clearly as those people who are a legitimate threat to your way of life or existence. Okay, so it's not the personal enemy. He even very clearly defines this and distinguishes it using the Bible to do so, the difference between inimicus and hostis in the, Latin. And that he's very clear that what we're talking about here is not inimicus, not the personal enemy, but hostis, the hostile foe that wishes to undo. So foe might be a better word, but at any rate. And then the friends he never actually defines. He never actually clearly defines who the friends are. It's considered a major loophole in his book, but it boils down to friends are the friends who fight the enemies. And so that's where we get back to that same logic I just described to you in the communist. If you don't take up the only way to deal with this allegedly existential threat is to declare yourself against it. And then anybody who doesn't declare themselves against it has declared themselves for it. You have this zero-sum, actually negative-sum, outright total polarization of the entire field. And then to consider that the only thing that politics actually is, where politics refers to the polis, the city in the Greek conception, and all of the distribution of power and authority throughout the entire city-state as a kind of an organization of people. Like there's no other method at the end of the day except one faction fighting the other in an existential battle that will destroy the other. And like I said, the real problem with it is if there's an enemy that is declared and somebody has the power to declare the enemy, with critical theory, it's not an individual, it's not Mao, it's not Stalin, it's not Lenin, it's not the Jacobins or a movement. It is in fact the theory itself. But if the theory can declare an enemy, or a legitimate leader can declare the enemy, or the sovereign declares the enemy, Schmitt gives that power to a sovereign, like Hitler, being the Führer, the top of the hierarchy. Once they declare an enemy, everybody who doesn't fight the enemy is also an enemy. So if Hitler decides that Ernst Röhm is an enemy, this is the Night of Long Knives story, everybody who doesn't fight against Ernst Röhm and his Sturmabteilung unit is now also the enemy, which can therefore be treated as, Mao would call them, enemies of the people, which would then lead to being purged, being hanged, being imprisoned, or whatever else. So it's a total polarization logic. And the reason we've polarized is because the left adopted it. And the reason that people on the right are adopting it is because by adopting it, the left became very politically strong. It is like a cheat code to political might. But the problem is, so it's contagious. The only way you feel like you can resist it is by adopting it yourself. But the problem is that you've now entered into basically this, not to quote Nietzsche too positively, but now you've wrestled with monsters and become the monster as a result. You've stared into the abyss and this abyss stared back into you. Rather than appealing to, higher order ways of dealing with the political circumstance, you have fallen down to its most basic, most brutish mentality, usually out of fear and despair. But it's a total war of our group versus their group mentality. And again, if you didn't like being canceled, you're against the friend-enemy distinction. If you don't like cancel culture is the friend-enemy distinction. You are either a trans ally or friend, or else you are a transphobic bigot enemy. There's nothing in between. So if you don't toe exactly the line, bang, you're on the wrong side of the dichotomy. That's why it's bad. It's not that there are friends and enemies and that we sometimes have to take these things seriously, that we sometimes have to make uncomfortable alliances, and or like when the Western Alliance joined in with the Soviets to beat the Nazis in World War II, sometimes you do make uncomfortable alliances. Sometimes there were, and that was going to lead to the Cold War and all the rest that followed. But the fact of the matter is, and the other option would have been that we allied with the fascists against the communists. There would have been no other option. That's what Hitler was doing, was going east, but we allied against the fascists. Sometimes you have to do that. Sometimes it's real. The existence of enemies, the existence of having to make awkward alliances or even co-belligerence alliances does not authenticate this logic that everybody who's not with me is against me. That boils down to the, in my opinion, very dark, almost evil logic of the friend-enemy distinction. And plus, like I said, Schmidt says that the sovereign gets to determine the enemy, and once it's declared, everybody goes along with it. So now you've completely submitted to an authority figure that you're also saying has the right to declare you an enemy, to declare you worthy of a drone strike if you don't join in his crusade. So now you are not thinking for yourself. You're a subservient automaton in somebody else's agenda, which might not be a good agenda.
Yeah. So how does this play out? I'm gonna bring this together in just a few moments with Israel. How does this play out? We see what has happened within the Democrat Party because they've been unwilling to stand against the radicals within their midst. So now we see the emerging Democrat socialists and everything that's, the resurgence of communism under maybe a different name or a different tack. But we also see this happening on the right. And it seems like there's an unwillingness. There wasn't a willingness within the left, and now it's overtaken them. There seems like there's an unwillingness on the right to call these things out. And so I just want to talk about that for a few moments, and then we're going to pivot to Israel, because I think that kind of embodies where we are.
Yeah, and I think it's based mostly in that desperation, the recognition that the left is acting as a kind of terrifying bloc, that we don't have the kind of support we need to, say, vote them out or to prosecute or whatever else. That we have a badly infiltrated and subverted system as the set of tools that we're working with, so that things that should work don't work, like, prosecuting somebody who, violated the laws. You can think of probably 1,000 examples. The entire state of California, for anything under $1,000 worth of stealing, has made this like the law of the land. So we all kind of understand that desperation, that fear that, oh my gosh, everything's upside down. And the only way to fight back against it is to basically do the same thing back. If they're going to use illegitimate weapons, we need illegitimate weapons. If they're going to put Goliath in front of the army, we need Goliath in front of our army too, which of course is not quite how that story goes. And so the temptation is clear. It even has a doctrine which has got two names which have slightly different applications, not to make it too complicated, but there are no enemies to the right and no enemies on the right, which is that we need to stick together. We need to have this giant coalition, so we're not going to fight with each other. If some guy over here is spouting off really radical stuff that you don't agree with, maybe even white nationalism, maybe even, Nazi stuff, which is happening. It's not actually even all that fringe anymore. Well, he's on our side against the left, against the enemy. So he's our friend against the enemy, because the friends are the friends who fight the enemy. So we have to just let that be. We can deal with our housekeeping later or whatever. But what you end up doing is setting yourself up exactly like the left. The left kind of had that same mentality. We have to beat the moral majority. We have to beat the Christian right. And so they radicalized themselves. Eventually, we have to beat Trump, and Trump derangement syndrome is like the best expression of this logic. And they basically lost all of their soul in the process. It was the friends are the friends who fight Trump. And or before that, the moral majority and the Christian right. That's, right wing watch. All of these things came into existence in order to create that mentality on the left that they were in an existential fight. And if they didn't all basically drop all nuance and fight the battle, that they were going to lose their entire, progressive way of life and all of its progressive gains that we've had. And you can see what it did to them. As a matter of fact, if it wasn't for Trump derangement syndrome and a couple of other things and some of the activity of the woke right scaring people off, what this has resulted in is the Democratic Party is ultimately so unpopular right now. If everybody actually showed up to vote, hint, hint, Christians who vote in low numbers, if everybody actually showed up to vote, they would probably be about a 30% party. Yeah. Even like with all of their cheating, they're very unpopular right now. They could have the entire mantle stolen. I talk to Democrats all the time who have had enough. They're scared, they're worried, but they're scared of Trump more. Therefore, they keep voting for Democrats that they're terrified of. And that's the logic here, right? And so if the Republicans do this, I don't know why. I'm not saying it's fair. Turns out life's not fair. I'm not saying it's good or fair or good or what. I'm not making any judgment. This is literally just a fact. People in general, your average moderate in the country is much more scared of a radical right wing than they are of a radical left wing. There are probably very interesting reasons for that I haven't figured out. They're not just like this mythology about Hitler. They're much deeper. They're much more scared of a radical right wing than a radical left wing. And the Republican Party or the right wing will be punished vastly more severely by adopting this logic openly than will the Democrats. And so what it's going to turn into is massive Democrat victories from a extraordinarily unpopular party, which is how you end up getting tyrants elected into office.
Yeah. No, you're right. And I think, my view of that was because of there's a true north, logos, there's a principled way in which we view the world. And, from a Christian worldview perspective, if you claim to be a Christian, yet you're a white nationalist or you're a Nazi or you're any of those things, that to me, that's a perversion of the Christian faith and does great harm to what we would hold fast to and believe is true. So, when you look to the left, you say, okay, it's the left. They could care less. But when someone's masquerading in those ways, it's quite damaging. Let me just say this real quick. We're going to get to Israel. I just want to go back to this thought, and you can speak to it. Now, you wrote a lot about this. You don't need to spend time on this. I want to spend just the final moments that we'll have a little bit with Israel. But applied postmodernism, so critical race theory, queer theory, intersectionality, identity politics, DEI, you kind of go through the gamut, all of these things. And it can be confusing, and then we're going to say, well, you know what? Fortunately, I'm in a good school district. My boy went to, a safe college. They're not being infected or affected by any of these things. Could you speak to that for a moment? Because I think education itself is a great concern. It's under attack. I just was watching some of your clips and talking about that. Makes some great perspectives. But the average person's like, hey, we go to a good school, even a good Christian school. The reality is that this has it's baked in to the culture. Maybe just talk about that for a few moments, and then we'll hit Israel.
Now, there's kind of two sides to this. The first side is when you said, hypothetically, somebody listening is thinking my kids go to a good school, they go to a safe college. My thought was, no, they don't. Actually, no, they don't.
Yeah.
Like you might think that because you don't know what's going on. No, they don't. The colleges of education in the Marxist own telling were completely colonized, completely controlled by 1992. Everything from then has only been a rapid acceleration. They have had complete control over the personnel, the ideology, the curriculum of every teacher, every administrator, etc., that's able to get a license for 30 years. Your kids do not go to a safe school. There are virtually zero safe public high schools. There are probably zero elite private high schools that are safe. In fact, they're worse than the public schools, because the purpose of an elite private high school is to get your kid into Harvard, which is so woke that Claudine Gay was its president. And maybe if you're in a good Christian school or a Catholic school or a religious school, I know a lot of people are picking these up. Like I have some extended family who's put their kids in Catholic school because it's the only kind of option around. And even they send me like, is this woke? And they send me stuff. And I'm just like, holy moly, what's going on? It is in everything. And I know a Protestant can sit back and say, well, that's Catholic and the social justice of the Jesuits. You are not safe. Texas Christian University, I mean, across the board. I had a friend that I was talking to in the Dallas area for a long time that was he was in like the 5th school district that he had found that were all school that were all Baptist Christian schools. And he would, one after the next, he'd get his kids in it. And a year later, they'd bring in the woke policy or the woke curriculum or the woke BS. It's almost unavoidable. It is almost unavoidable. But let's say that you are one of the maybe 10%, your kid is in a parochial school, and it's one of the maybe 10% of parochial schools that aren't infected, because that's the only place you'll find a non-infected school. There's like two private universities that aren't infected. The rest are infected. It's about your kid is either safe or not because you've given him the right values, not because he's in a safe school against woke. That's the bottom line on that. But let's say that he's in one of that small percentage. Doesn't matter. Every other peer in the society is steeped in this. It's like trying to take the brown out of tea after you soak the tea bag in it. The water has turned woke. Then you cannot get the tea back out of the water once you brew it. And that's how our culture is. So unless you're preparing your kids for the culture, unless you're preparing them for the road they're going to walk and be able to understand woke when they encounter it and fight it off, it doesn't matter. You are not immune. Your child is not immune. And this thing is designed so that it will fire issue after issue after issue after issue until one hits their heart. It either makes them enthusiastic, or it makes them scared, or it makes them hurt on behalf of somebody else, empathetic or whatever, or it makes them resentful of the situation they're in. And this is called the generative themes method of education and the education for liberation model that was based on Mao Zedong's math line. I mean, this whole thing this is what took over our colleges of education. The point is to hit you, whether it's entertainment, whether it's education, whether it's the culture, whether it's their friends or some group that they end up hanging out with, to hit them until something catches. It's like throwing spaghetti at the wall, but it's more like throwing, little tiny spaghetti noodles, and every single one that sticks is an invitation to pull them in, and they can get pulled in fast. And on the other hand, they can get pulled into the reaction against it, this radical rejection of woke that emulates woke by throwing out all boundaries, adopting friend-enemy politics, acting Machiavellian, which, we're going to see manifestations of in the intersectional pile is straight white Christian man bad. The reaction is straight white Christian man better than everybody else, right? Supremacy. And if you're not pulled one way, they're going to get pulled the other. So nobody's safe from this. This is the contaminated situation that we're in. Our society has got to this point, and Christians are part of the society. Even if they are in the world but not of it, they are in the world, and they have to be able to prepare their children for being in that world as well. And so that they can stay, but not of it, without getting pulled down the drain of this woke stuff, which is everywhere.
Yeah, that's so well said. I mean, way that I would articulate that, it's a discipleship issue. And the training and giving truth and discernment, working that within your family or outworking that with your children is so vital and important, because it's sort of, I think, one of the reasons it's hard for maybe everyone's so confused what's happening culturally, because it's kind of explaining fish to water. You've grown up in it, and it's like, and you're not really understanding. And so my hope is as we've listened to some of these things, and we'll expose you to maybe more material, that you begin to understand that, hey, we've been baked into a system of, beyond this, but, critical theory, postmodernism, and something that's opposite, in opposition, satanic, whatever term you want to use, to a Christian worldview. And it is deception. It is the original deception. Did God really say? It is the power to be God. And there's great opportunity for awakening and revival. And awakening, I think one of those awakenings that can happen, and I just want to spend a few moments on this. I think we share much, we say similar concerns and would be the way I want to articulate this, admiration for Israel and for the Jewish people. I know
absolutely.
that you have been very clear. Unfortunately, I continue to watch. There it is. I love it. Did you get your $7,000? Are you ready for those comments underneath, right?
This came with a check. It's great.
Yeah.
Or actually, I picked it up at a Christian church here in the United States that was offering them for free.
Yeah. So we, at our church, we are unapologetically stand with Israel. I do that both theologically because there's a lineage and there's a land and a covenant that God has not superseded. So supersessionism is a view. I don't believe it's a biblical view, and I believe it's the fruit of it has been horrific historically. But even geopolitically, we stand with Israel because of the obvious nature. Even though you have Tom Massey and others saying, they run everything. America rules the world, and Israel helps do our bidding in that part of the world. That's just that's a grown-up talk. America runs the world. Everything runs on the dollar. Everyone does our bidding. Israel is a part of that, and it's so annoying and infuriating for me to see many on the woke right, Israel and the ROI that we get from Israel and our relationship with them is just ridiculous. We get so much more and benefit from them. So I see it both within a geopolitical sense, but also in a biblical sense. But what's happening with Israel really plays into everything that we've talked about today. So I'm just going to let you take the floor with that and help people understand, why does everybody all of a sudden, I believe it's demonic, it's evil, it's prophetic, it's historic, and ongoing, hate Israel, and how does that play into what we're seeing and what we've been talking about today?
Yeah, I mean, so you're right. There's more than one argument. I usually separate it into three pieces, which I actually got from Lucas Miles, who directs Turning Point Faith, which are the practical argument, the moral argument, and the theological argument. I don't dabble too much in the theological argument myself, but I think the moral argument and the practical argument are extraordinarily strong. Even like you said, the ROI. I asked Grok about this one time. It's like, how does the ROI that America gets from its partnership with Israel, including the monies that go that way, how does that compare to other returns on investment? And it was basically, it came back with this detailed analysis that I couldn't possibly repeat from memory, but pages and pages and pages of how it all breaks down. But it said that it's by far one of the biggest ROIs of any investment that anybody makes anywhere in the world right now is the American investment in Israel is coming back at something like, like a 500% or something like that. If you were to break it down into raw monetary value, it's rather incredible. But yeah, we don't have to get into those three arguments themselves, but I do want to talk about how it's become this object of the friend-enemy distinction in this kind of woke paradigm, both left and right. Actually, I like to say we all talk about the horseshoe theory, that the idea at the ends, the far left and the far right are bent around and almost touching each other. And I like to say that imagine it's electrified and there's that lightning bolt going across, and the lightning bolt spells Jews as it's shocking across the bottom there. And the radical left has been against Israel since at least 1967, arguably not before that, because the Soviets thought that they could loop them in. Then it became a very big Soviet push following the 6-Day War, because USS Liberty, that happened during the 6-Day War on June 8th, 1967, and everybody's like, oh, that's why Israel's not a good ally. I don't know if they know that when that happened, the U.S. and Israel were not actually allies yet. And then the U.S. and Israel alliance started immediately after that. That's how upset and bothered the U.S. was about this accidental attack on one of our spy ships that was undeclared, other than a small flag flying, on one of their flagpoles. So that's when the alliance began. And that's when the Soviets were like, okay, we're on the side of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, which they created. They started to infuse the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO. This was all Soviet derived. All of our favorite leftists, Angela Davis, a lot of these woke, precursors and early woke people, not just took up the Palestinian cause like under Edward Said's Orientalism and the post-colonial third worldist line, but they literally went there and trained tactics with like the precursor organizations of Hamas. And maybe Hamas now, I don't know for sure on that, but they literally like are entwined. So the left has been on that side for a long time. The right has not. There have always been like anti-Semites and like whatever lurking around in far right corners. But this thing is new. This phenomenon is really back to about 2022, kind of operationally preparing, maybe back to 2014, 15. Operational preparing. You see hints of Duginism creeping into the radical right, the so-called alt-right back in even the mid-2010s. And Dugin is...
Who is Alexander Dugin? Just a quick...
Yeah. Alexander Dugin is a Russian weirdo, philosopher, who is sometimes called Putin's brain. He wrote a famous book in 1997 called The Foundations of Geopolitics that was used as a training manual or an essential reading, not a training manual, a book of essential reading for the officer corps of the Russian military for many years. I don't know when that stopped or if it has stopped. It might be continuous to stay, but certainly from late 1990s going forward, his philosophy about geopolitics was the philosophy that the Russian officer corps of the military trained under. He's been called Putin's brain. It's not clear that Putin likes him, but it is clear that some of the strategy that Putin's executing, like in Ukraine and other places, follows Dugin's prescriptions. And Dugin is explicit. If you read The Foundations of Geopolitics, which I've read most of it, I haven't quite finished it. It's 600 pages long or something. If you read that, it's very clear. There's entire sections dedicated to their alliance with Iran, with the specifically Shia Muslims more than the Sunni Muslims. He's very into the Shia for some reason. He says it's an Orthodox tradition, just like Russian Orthodox. He's an Orthodox tradition. Therefore, it tells you, the secrets of all the universe if you get to the bottom of it or whatever. So he's very friendly, and this has been creeping in since the mid 2010s. So maybe it's older than that, than just the last 3 to 4 years, but it's been certainly like a pimple that's come to a head in the last 3 to 4 years. And what it is it's what you're seeing with Hassan Piker on the left, and you're seeing from characters even like Thomas Massie on the right, is this voice that if you are a politician and you run a pro-Israel campaign, Democrat or Republican, you will lose. That's the claim. It seems to be bearing out on the Democrat side. It does not seem to be bearing out yet on the Republican side, but we know that there's a massive shift in young Republicans, in military enlisted people, to being very deeply anti-Israel now from a variety of, in my opinion, from a barrage of propaganda that has effectively poisoned their minds. It's given them a mind virus. I say things all the time like, if you are anti-Israel now, you're the guy wearing the mask from a few years ago. You're the person at the restaurant holding up the fist in the girl's face. This thing has been in my opinion, almost total psyop coming from Iran, Russia, and its partners to convince Americans to split their relationship with Israel. And it's being used as a friend-enemy point. If you are pro-Israel, then you are enemy. And if you don't fight against Israel with us, if you don't blame Israel for our problems, if you don't demand the separation of our two countries, then you are part of the enemy and you have to be destroyed. Hence, your $7,000 joke, which is that anybody who says anything pro-Israel is accused of being paid $7,000 from the Israeli government to promote Israel. Funny enough, do you know where it's now been shown where that $7,000 accusation actually originated from? It came from the Iranian lobby. What a big surprise. It literally was an Iranian propaganda point that has been pushed for over a year with almost, devastating consequences to people that are trying to be in favor of the U.S.-Israel alliance. Israel in and of itself as a sovereign nation resisting barbarism versus civilization, basically. And even the United States and Trump with his positive relationships and so on. So I think it's overwhelmingly propaganda that was falling on well-prepared soil. Some of that preparation was Duginistic thinking. Some of that preparation was the demoralization about the failures and catastrophes out of the Iraq War and military adventurism by Bush Doctrine neocons, as they get called, which is right. The Bush Doctrine people did a lot of things wrong. The democracy builders were actually wrong in their approach. But that was used to demoralize people. And now all of those things are framed as Israel's wars. So it's Americans going to die for another country that they don't even respect. This is all that critical theory, pulling the heartstrings.
So ridiculous.
False ethos, bringing you into pathos to take you off of logos. It's the same exact critical pattern, the exact same, like I said, Machiavellian lying and distorting the situation in order to gain power, and the exact same friend-enemy distinction. If you're with Israel, you're against us. And have to be treated as an existential enemy. And that, like I said, it's happening on both Democrat and Republican side. Hassan Piker and some of these guys on the radical right are saying exactly the same things in this regard.
Yes. And it's quite concerning. And it's an adopting of a, as you said, it's like 2020 mask where you're being propagandized. You may not realize it. And I think if one could just take a step back and say, okay, why are the Jewish people the most maligned, mistreated, persecuted, like throughout history? And now all of a sudden, out of nowhere on a dime, now they are to blame for all of our ills, not radical Islam, not crappy politicians that are bought off, that don't know how to budget and all these things. No, it's actually this mysterious cabal that nobody really knows quite a lot about, but if they watch enough, YouTube videos on the internet, they're convinced. It's so frustrating because it is a mind virus. I believe it's a demonic deception. It's very old and prophetic in nature, but it goes along with the continual deception that we're seeing, kind of spider webs from everything that we talked about, that you laid out, that's infected our culture and society. It is odd. I would like to hear just the last thoughts on this. It is odd to me when you think of the oppressor and the oppressed, logic and reasoning, which tugs at the heartstrings. And people say, oh, that poor, whatever, fill in the blank. We need to support them because the big, mean, evil United States, the big, mean, evil Christian. When you think of Israel, it's such a small nation. It's tiny in stature and ability. It's surrounded by enemies, yet the opposite happens. It's treated as the oppressor of the Palestinians. Just give me your perspective on that. I'm just curious.
This is Soviet propaganda. It started in the late 1960s. This is straight Soviet propaganda. The Soviets created the narrative that Israel was the outpost through all of history of the British Empire, not all of history, but back a couple hundred years of the British Empire and then the American Empire. So it's not Jews, it's not Israel as a small nation or a nation with F-35s or anything like that, or a sovereign nation with its own military that can defend itself for the first time in millennia. It's that it is an outpost of Western imperialism, and all of this other doctrine is all derivative to that. I was reading Edward Said's Orientalism again the other day. This is published in the late 1970s, either 78 or 79. And he's a Palestinian American. He was an English professor, a literature professor at Columbia, very good writer, very, sympathetic writer, decent thinker. And he's got his whole justification for his entire theory of how the entire Near East, but really Israel, is treated, is that it's all just Western imperialism projecting into that region, and being not just unwilling, but unable to understand the perspective of the poor, oppressed Arab or whatever other communities. It's almost always Arabs, which then become identified in this kind of construction called the Palestinian people and the Palestinian cause, which was a Soviet project. But when Said is saying imperialism, 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 he's just repeating a decade down the road the Soviet line about the exact same thing. So this is just derivative, watered down, remixed so that it hides its original origins, Soviet propaganda against Western interests in the Middle East, which it wants to control because of the oil and the access to warm water ports geopolitically and philosophically because they hate the West.
Yeah. At the end of the day, that's what, from a political and geopolitical standpoint, it comes down to. It's a fight over the control of the power base, over finances, control of the world ultimately. And I hope that people would awaken to that. I would just say to my Christian friends that are listening that if the Bible tells us to love our enemies, And the Jewish people should not be your enemy. We hear the term Judeo-Christian ethic, which means obviously that we don't, the New Testament brings us Christ. It's the fulfillment. Everything points to Jesus. The whole point of the Bible is Jesus. The Old Testament is Jesus concealed. The New Testament, Jesus revealed. But he came to fulfill the law and the prophets, not to do away with, not a jot or tittle from the law and how we treat. And so we should have great respect and admiration for the Jews that God chose to bring the Messiah, the church, the Bible through, and yet we have this continual, we see this within theological circles where, we don't need the Jewish people. The Judeo, Christian word is a psyop, and it's just, it's tiresome, it's nonsensical, it's illogical, it's not biblical, and I would hope that you would turn from it if you're listening. So final words go to you, Dr. Lindsay.
I agree completely with what you just said. That's my final words. I hope that people will not tire of doing good in the world, of being salt and light like Charlie demonstrated for us all, and to take up that example, and not to retreat from the world. Remember that you are in it, and to do what the Jewish people are called and chosen to do, which is to do good and therefore be a light unto the others out in the world, the other nations, the other people. So don't tire of doing good. Don't tire of the truth, and don't tire of your mission and your calling.
James, thanks for being on the Courage and Faith podcast. Thanks for tuning in. Share it with a friend, and let's disrupt the narrative and begin thinking clearly once again. Thanks for tuning in. Hey, thanks so much for listening to the podcast. My hope is that something in this conversation encouraged you, challenged you, or just helped you to see things just a little more clearly. If it did, I'd love for you to share this with someone who needs it, or just subscribe so we can keep having these conversations together. Keep standing firm, keep walking in faith, and remember, you are made to be courageous.